Hello, and welcome back to Story Time with Eric Zimmer. This year, in honor of Jim Henson's would-have-been 85th birthday, I decided to share with you a book about the Muppets that I got for Christmas a few years ago. I realize I'm wearing a Looney Tunes shirt, but I couldn't find a Muppet shirt I own, so sue me. This is The Art of the Muppets. Behind the scenes, the first 25 years of Muppet magic, from 1955 till 1980, which leads up to the Muppet movie. I always wanted to read this book out loud, and, well, now I'd like to share it with you, all you Muppet lovers out there. So you ready? Alright, let's begin. The word puppet comes from the Latin pupa, meaning doll. But puppets are more than dolls, for there is in them the illusion of life. They can become symbols of our own lives, and occasionally mirrors in which we are startled, and sometimes delighted, to see ourselves reflected. Puppetry is an ancient art form, one that has flourished for centuries in virtually every corner of the world. Types of puppets are as various as the cultures that gave them birth. In India, ghostly shadow puppets of beautiful workmanship dance across black backlit screens. In Sicily, Italy, nearly life-size medieval knights in full armor clash in thunderous battle, while in England, children at the seaside still giggle as Mr. Punch thwacks his wife with a slapstick, a drubbing she has been enduring for some 300 years. Puppets probably go back to man's earliest rites and religious ceremonies. In the 5th century BC, the Greek historian Herodotus referred in his writings to fertility figures operated by wires and strings. These first marionettes, fashioned of clay, wood, ivory, wax, and sometimes bronze, were known by the marvelously evocative name Agomata Neurospasta, pictures moved by strings, quote unquote. One of the chief fascinations of puppetry is that, as a form of expression, it encompasses just about every other art or craft known to man. Design and sculpture, painting and writing, acting and musicianship. And it covers almost every form of theater, from passion plays to Punch and Judy, from grand opera to low burlesque. In the hands of a skilled actor, a puppet, which may be no more than a carved wooden head attached to a piece of cloth, moves, speaks, and acquires a personality. To our unending amazement, an inanimate object comes to life. Probably the best-known traditional puppet in our culture is the aforementioned Mr. Punch. In his book, The Art of the Puppet, Bill Baird described him as, quote-unquote, a commoner at odds with his surroundings, his adversaries, the landlord, the judge, the hangman, death, the devil, the policeman, even his wife. Because he is a puppet, he can carry out our outrageous fantasies, such as hanging a policeman or clubbing his spouse. Like all classic characters, he is very much a product of the society that embraced him, an embodiment of its strengths, its fears, and its frustrations. Magic evidence that grim reality can be banished, allowing the audience to touch for a time that naive and hopeful place in itself that still believes in the miraculous. The puppeteer also manipulated Mr. Punch, and his entire supporting cast often worked alone. His stage was a little booth with a folding screen for a backdrop. Often it was about the size and shape of a television set. That puppet came early to television is no surprise. Bill and Cora Baird and Burr Tillstrom, pioneers of the medium, were classic puppeteers whose work delighted millions. Perhaps the most significant difference between their work and that of the Muppets is that Burr and the Bairds had perfected their art while television was in its infancy, and in their television appearances they continued to work in the manner of traditional puppeteers, allowing the camera to show pictures of what they were doing. The Muppets, however, were children of television, and were born because Jim Henson, their creator, was fascinated by the medium and its extraordinary technological possibilities. As a teenager growing up in a suburb of Washington, D.C., Jim was interested in all aspects of television, and one of puppetry's chief appeals for him, then as now, was its age-old challenge, the opportunity it gave him to involve himself in everything: building, designing, constructing scenery, writing, and performing. During his senior year in high school, he heard that a local television station was holding auditions for young puppeteers and tried out. He got the job. What else is new? No, I mean that's a good thing. Entering the University of Maryland that fall, he studied art and scenic design and continued to make appearances on local television, using his puppetry as a means to learn the ins and outs of the medium. Towards the end of his freshman year, he was offered a late-night 5-minute show of his own on WRC, the NBC affiliate in Washington. He asked Jane Nebel, a fellow art student, to work with him on the show. They called it Sam and Friends, and Jim dubbed their troupe the Muppets. From the outset, there were a couple of surprising things about the Muppets. They didn't work on a stage or in a puppet theater. The television set was their theater. And you can see Jim and Jane Henson in front of a camera with the puppets. They look so young. The performers worked freestanding in the open studio, watching neither the actual puppets nor each other, but following the movements of their puppets on TV monitors. This gave them great control and gave their performances a remarkable feeling of freedom. This was enhanced by Jim's growing familiarity with the medium and his use of camera tricks and lens changes to exaggerate a sense of movement or an illusion of distance. The other interesting aspect of the early Muppet characters was that none of them actually were anything recognizable. They were instead strange, somewhat abstract creatures that did strange things to each other, and to whatever else happened to be handy. Just before his graduation, Jim, unsure where his future lay, in television, in art, and in puppets, traveled to Europe. There, for the first time in his life, he met other professional puppeteers, respected artists whose creativity and accomplishments gave him a renewed sense of the legitimacy and credibility of puppetry as an art. He returned to the world of Sam and Friends, a show that was to run for 8 years and win a local Emmy in 1958. During this time, Jim and Jane, they were married in 1959 and subsequently had 5 children, began to evolve the style that we now recognize as particular to the Muppets. There are 4 basic aspects of this style, 4 elements that, when combined, create these unique creatures. 1, their design. 2, their fabrication. 3, their performance. And 4, their interaction with the media through which they perform. Now let's talk a little bit about the design. Hold on. Muppets don't look like traditional puppets. Although the characters that appeared on Saturday Night Live, for example, are markedly different from those on Sesame Street, they can all be in the same room at the same time, and somehow none seems out of place. There is a certain aesthetic that began with Sam and Friends and has continued through the Muppet Show as a consistency of vision that is the Muppet look. One can certainly see the ancestors of Sesame Street's Ernie and Bert, or Bert and Ernie, whichever way it is, created in the late 1960s, in some of the Muppets made for Sam and Friends over 20 years ago, and discern in the wild-eyed and looming visages of the Frackles and Monsters of the 1960s a direct link to the dim life glimmering beneath the surface of Saturday Night as Plubus and Scred. Perhaps a key reason for this is that when Jim Henson was evolving his idea of what his kind of puppet should be, he had only his own instincts to guide him. He had never worked for another puppeteer. He began alone and had to work out his own design solutions in order to create the kinds of characters he felt were best suited to the television screen. When he set about building a new character, there was no particular style of puppet, no predetermined method of construction to limit his approach. Thus there evolved a Muppet style that turned out to be quite different from what anyone else was doing. On a side note, the name Muppet comes from a combo of the names marionette and puppet. Bet you didn't know that. Anyways, a central figure in the development of this Muppet look was the late Don Sahlin. He was working with Burr Tillstrom around 1960 when Jim met him and asked him to help with some puppet building. About a year later, he joined the Muppets full-time, and for the next 12 years or so, built virtually all the Muppets. Don worked from sketches provided by Jim. The way Don and I used to work, Jim recalls, is that I would generally do a little scribble, which Don would call the essence that he was working towards. Don had a very simple way of working, reducing all non-essential things and zeroing in on what was important. It was this simplifying process of Don's that was the major factor in creating the basic look that people think of as the Muppets. From the fairly primitive beginnings of Sam and Friends, Don refined the look, adding such classic puppets to the Muppet family as Rolf the Dog, the first non-abstract or representational Muppet, principally because he was designed for a dog food commercial, and Sesame Street's Ernie, Bert, and Cookie Monster. Perhaps the single most important aspect of the Muppet look is the set of the eyes in relation to the nose and the mouth. Now, the Muppet people call this the magic triangle. Correctly positioned, it creates a central focal point